And you say you will be relative to me.
Okay.
So
Try and stay in Spain.
yeah, or it's okay if you don't. So tēnā koutou katoa, welcome everybody. No mai haere mai. I'm Josephine Johnston. I work in the Bioethics Centre, and I'm also part-time at the Hastings Centre, which is in New York, part-time and remote. And that's how I know today's speaker. So it's my real pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Joel Michael Reynolds. So I met Joel at the Hastings Centre, where he was a postdoctoral fellow, and that's in New York. And then as now, Joel's work explored fundamental issues at the intersection of ethics, biomedicine, and society, with a special focus on disability. And in particular, Joel is concerned with the meaning of disability, the issue of ableism, and how philosophical inquiry into each might improve the lives of disabled people. Joel comes to us now from Washington, DC, where they are Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Disability Studies at Georgetown University and Senior Research Scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Joel is also a Senior Bioethics Advisor to and Fellow of the Hastings Centre and a Faculty Scholar at the Greenwell Foundation. And at Georgetown, Dr. Reynolds is also core faculty in the Disability Studies Program, affiliated faculty in Medical Humanities Initiative, and a faculty fellow at Ethics Lab, and Director of Graduate Placement in the Department of Philosophy. That sounds like a lot, and it's amazing that you can even be here today with us. Recognising gaps in the philosophy and disability literature, Joel has co-founded the book series Oxford Studies in Disability, Ethics and Society, and is the founder of the Journal of Philosophy and Disability. And this is a new academic journal that is just has its third volume out right now, actually this month, which includes articles on wellbeing, disability, justice, gene editing utopianism, which I had a read of, and phenomenology. Joel is a really prolific writer. So in addition to lots and lots of journal articles, they're the author or co-editor of 7 books, including The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain and Morality, which is your first book, I think, isn't it? And the Disability Bioethics Reader from Routledge. And somehow right now has 2 books forthcoming, Philosophy of Disability, an Introduction, and The Meaning of Disability, which is a book that shares its title with the title of today's seminar, The Meaning of Disability. And the way we're going to run the seminar is Joel will give a presentation, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A where people can ask any questions that they wish. So if you have a question, please hold it until the Q&A, and we'll remember to come to the people on the Zoom as well. So we'll manage that. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Joel, so join me.
Hello, everybody. It is a real honor and pleasure to be here today. And thanks so much to Josie, Dr. Johnston, for the invitation. I've been a fan of and following Josie's work for many, many, many years, and you are all extremely lucky to have her as a colleague. In terms of accessibility housekeeping, obviously, please use the space in any way that you need to. If anything goes wrong, including our Zoomers here, please let me know so we can address the issue. First of all, I just want to give a big thank you to the colleagues, staff, and students at various places I work at or advise for. They're all awesome, and I'm just grateful to have some amazing people around me. I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose, except for my undying love of my miniature dachshund Schnurr, who you can see here, editing a paper of mine that he thought was trash. I did not publish that paper. I also want to give a thank you to my family. Really, all of the work that I do in one way or another arises from and responds to experiences I had with my family and still have for those who are around. And so I want to give my gratitude to them and their precious lives. The title of this talk is The Meaning of Disability. And there are many ways to start such an inquiry and to talk about the meaning of disability. But because I'm trained as a philosopher and I was trained in the quote unquote history of philosophy, quote unquote Western philosophical tradition, if I don't start with Plato or Socrates, they take away my philosophy card. Therefore, let's think about what was happening 3 days before Socrates was to drink the hemlock after being sentenced to death by 544 of his Athenian peers for, as we all know, just being annoying. That was his the real reason he was sentenced to death, is he was an annoying person. Anyway, he's sitting there and he turns to his friend Crito and he says, is life worth living in a body that's in a bad and corrupted condition, right? Somatos is the Greek there. And in a single word in the Greek, odamos, Crito responds, of course not. Fast forward just a number of decades, and Aristotle in politics, arguably one of the founding texts of the quote unquote Western liberal tradition, he goes out of his way to mention, as for the exposure and rearing of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live. I don't know why I left the Greek off there. It's peperomenon. This is about as close to the word disability in English as you're going to get in Attic Greek. There's not really a perfect catch-all phrase, but it's mostly, it would primarily be referring to physical disabilities in this case. Now let's fast forward well over 2 millennia. It's the height in some ways of the eugenics movement in the United States. It's also going very, very well in Britain. It's going so well that the Nazis, of course, will look to the US and Britain as a model for how they're going to carry out what they did during primarily World War II. There's a Supreme Court decision in 1927, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., I think the third, I think I left that off. He decides in writing the majority opinion, he says, look, it's just better for all the world if society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And with the Supreme Court decision, it was made the law of the land that women who were in state and federal, or it might have just been federal institutions, could be forcibly sterilized, right? Sterilized against their will without any consent. Let's jump forward a few more decades. And let's go to a book that is now in its 9th edition, Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. And Singer makes the claim, he modifies the language just slightly over the course of the editions, but the general thought holds that killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. And not to break the seriousness of this claim, but if you're a philosopher and someone says, let's put your photo on the front of the book, maybe get a better person to set up the shot. There's so much to say about this image of Peter. I love the lighting. What is happening in the back? I digress. Let's fast forward a few more decades. Harvard psychologist Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker is writing an op-ed in the Boston Globe. And the point of the op-ed is to say bioethicists are getting in the way. Stop doing the thinking, stop worrying about the ethics. You're slowing us down. And he writes, even a 1-year delay in implementing an effective treatment could spell death, suffering, or disability for millions of people. And he explicitly links death, suffering, and disability as 3 things that we're supposed to take as more or less synonymous in the sense of being obviously bad and that no one would want to experience. Now, there is a lot one can say about these historical and contemporary examples. There's a lot to worry about and a lot to think about, but I want to bring our attention to something so obvious. It might have slipped to your attention. It's that every single one of these examples is an able-bodied person making a judgment about what it's like to be disabled. Every single one of these is someone who's able-bodied going, oh, imagining, trying to put themselves in the shoes of, assuming that they know what it's like, and then further making a judgment about the quality of what disabled experiences are like. And of course, in the same way that we would find it really weird for someone of, let's say you're of the Christian faith, making judgments about what it's like to live a life if you're Jewish, or what it's like to live a life if you're Buddhist, In the same way that we would, someone who is of a particular way of being racialized in the world, making judgments about exactly what it's like to be racialized in a different way, in the same way that we would hesitate about those judgments, I think we should really hesitate when able-bodied people make claims about disability on the assumption that somehow they know, just because they know. Why do able-bodied people in particular think that they have this knowledge? And why do they further think, when they imagine what it's like to be disabled and make these judgments, why do they typically assume that disability is negative? Well, if we look to the vast body of literature in disability studies, right, this is now 50, 60-year-old multi-interdisciplinary field. As of today, it includes, there's people working in disability studies in almost every single field in the humanities and social sciences. If we also look to the field of philosophy of disability, in some ways that's a subset of disability studies writ large. That field's been going on for about 30 years now. One explanation for what's going on here is that ableism is undergirding, it's underwriting the able-bodied judgments of disability. And it's not just ableism in general that's an issue. It's a specific feature of ableism that fools people into assuming that to be disabled is to experience something that's bad. To be disabled, in other words, and the way that the kind of shorthand for this is I just call this the ableist conflation, the conflation of experiences of disability with experiences of pain and suffering, and maybe also disadvantage. And this, I think, is the root, the kind of germ that's at the core. I just mixed my metaphors there. The germ at the core, delightful. It's the germ. I'll hold on to that. The germ at the core of what Socrates is saying, and what Aristotle is saying, and what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. III is saying, and Singer and Pinker. I think this is the actual what's at the bottom of it. So what is the ableist conflation? What is going on here? Why, in other words, why is it so common across the historical and contemporary examples I gave to make this conflation? Well, here's one way of thinking about the logic of the ableist conflation. And I showed this, I feel weird showing a picture of my book, but my editor at UMP will never work with me again if I don't actually show a picture of it when I give talks. I'm like, fine. This book really, the whole thing is devoted to trying to understand why the ableist conflation shows up across history. What is the root of it? And trying to pull apart and understand what it is about experiences of disability that are distinct from experiences of pain. And I do that through using the tools of phenomenology and kind of first-person qualitative work, thinking about what is it like to actually live in chronic pain. And my example there is someone living with complex regional pain syndrome type 1. And then I do a similar sort of analysis with someone living with degenerative MS. And I purposely picked a form of disability that does come along with a lot of difficult ability transitions. And lo and behold, I shouldn't give away the punchline of the book, because then you're like, well, I don't need to buy it now. But I'll give you the punchline. There are forms of disability where pain and suffering comes along. There are tons of forms where they do not. And the big error is linking them ahead of time without attending to the specificity of what it's like to be disabled. Having said that, there's the précis of the book. What is going on with the ableist conflation? What is its logic? Well, I think here's what's happening. And this is, I want to be very clear, this is implicit, right? It's not like Socrates gave the explanation I'm about to give, nor did Aristotle. I think the first assumption is that disability is considered fundamentally as a lack or deprivation. It is to be disabled is to have something missing that you would otherwise normally have. This is an assumption at the root of, I'm not saying this obviously, this is an assumption at the root of the ableist conflation. It's further assume the deprivation of potential and certainly expected goods, expected relative to some sense of normality, that's then considered an actual harm. Harm is understood to actually because they're related to the experience of pain and suffering. And given these three, again, usually implicit assumptions, you get something like disability causes pain and suffering. Now, of course, for my more philosophy of language-minded people, you'll notice there's a bunch of gaps and there's a bunch of like weird stuff happening here. This is not supposed to be a tightly formed argument where the inferences neatly follow from the premises. I'm trying to articulate a habit of thought that you see people exhibiting. That's what I'm trying to do here. The ableist conflation leads to all sorts of weird, problematic things in terms of how people think about disability. If you're familiar with disability studies or just disability activism for that matter, you will have heard this term inspiration porn, where typically able-bodied people hear about a disabled person doing something, often something completely regular. I don't know, went to prom, got a degree, and they'll be like, oh, isn't that inspiring? Look, oh, you did this thing. And this is referred to with lots and lots of derision. And if you do take inspiration from these examples, just don't anymore. Trust me, you should not. But the logic at play in inspiration porn is, I think, underwritten by the ableist conflation. You have to assume that the person is lacking in some way, that they're suffering in some way, and then you are inspired by them overcoming things. This I borrowed from, I can't remember the name of the website, but it really gets at it perfectly, the trope of being inspired by disabled people, where the ableist conflation is actually underwriting. I also would like to point out, not only does the ableist conflation lead to very problematic responses like you find in inspiration porn, it also, I think, underwrites a lot of disability hate crimes. And you might ask yourself, really? Are there hate crimes against people with disabilities? Well, yes. You can read this wonderful book by Mark Sherry, well, depressing, wonderfully researched, very depressing book by Mark Sherry about the prevalence of disability hate crimes. These seem to be of a higher prevalence in quote unquote wealthy countries, right? So colonizing countries that have stronger welfare systems. And you will find people acting out, typically able-bodied people acting out against disabled people, assuming that they are somehow receiving some benefit they don't actually deserve. There's a whole getting the ties between the ableist conflation and doing a disability hate crime. It requires a lot of jumps and weird loops, but that's often the case when people attack other people based on their social identity. So I have identified the ableist conflation as a problem. I have not actually explained in any detail why it is incorrect. Let me point out 4 ways in which I think it just fundamentally gets things wrong about disability. The first one is just straight up empirical, right? So we now have well over 30 years, depending upon how you look at the literature, somewhere near 40 years of social scientific data looking at the relationship between people with various types of disabilities and their quality of life / well-being / life satisfaction, fill in the blank of your preferred metric. This data is complex, but on the whole, it shows that most people with disabilities experience similar levels of quality of life. There's variation between having a congenital disability versus acquired. If it's acquired later in life, following a traumatic event, that's definitely going to pull things down. If depression and anxiety are either one's primary disability or comorbid with one's disability, that will pull it down. But still, this body of research on the whole suggests that you living a life with a disability means your life will go on the whole pretty well. Again, that's at the level of population. It does not mean everyone who is disabled, right? That is not making a claim about any given particular individual's life. Second, the ableist conflation gets something wrong epistemically in that, among other things, it commits epistemic injustice, textbook case of epistemic injustice against people with disabilities, right? It discounts their own testimony about their own lives. And you don't need to have a super robust conception of justice to think maybe you don't want to do that, or find a way to explain things without doing that at a minimum. Third, and in some ways, this is actually going to be the focus of the talk today, the ableist conflation is just conceptually incoherent. It confuses and it kind of homogenizes disability in a way that doesn't actually make sense, because disability, as we're going to go into much more details in a moment, is wildly complex and heterogeneous. It's actually so complex and heterogeneous, there are numerous philosophers today, I'll pick out 2 or 3 of them later, who think that the concept can't be defined univocally. It's, maybe it's some sort of family resemblance concept in a Wittgensteinian sense, but however you want to explain it, there is no actual unifying thing there.
I'm going to argue against it. But it's that is a view, a strong and well-defended view in the literature. And then last but not least, it's the ableist conflation makes a kind of ontological error. If you're not used to the sense of the way ontology is used as a term in continental philosophy, this might sound weird. I promise what I'm saying is coherent. It gets the meaning of disability, what it is actually like. I could have said existential, maybe that actually would have been clearer. It gets the actual lived experience of disability wrong, and the way in which disabilities can be world, and typically are, world shaping. Some disabilities, as we're going to talk about in a moment, are world creating. They shape and generate a new valued way of being. Some are world destroying. Chronic pain really sucks. And even though you can, in certain cases of chronic pain, you can still live an okay life, the pain is fundamentally restricting. And then there's a bunch of disabilities that, like most things in life, are in the middle. They're not necessarily fully kind of creative or destructive. They're just kind of mere differences or things that attenuate experience, but don't necessarily fully shape it. So how ought we go about rethinking disability? How ought we think about disability in a way that doesn't make the mistakes of the ableist conflation? Well, I said a moment ago that all those historical examples were able-bodied people making judgments about disability. What if we just listen to disabled people? Well, one way to do that is to focus upon disability activists. And the activist work that especially has been done in the US and the UK from the 1960s forward, though by no means limited to that. One of the central kind of tenets of disability activism historically has been a distinction between what's called the medical model of disability and a social model. Now, I want to say right at the outset, this is not high theory, right? This is realpolitik. This has been developed to do things in the real world at a political level. So if it doesn't seem like super, I don't know, highly refined, that's because you don't win political battles unless you have bumper stickers. And this is almost at the bumper sticker level. Having said that, we're going to see that this is really, really powerful as a consciousness raising tool, and also as a kind of interpretive hermeneutic tool to understand things. All right, so what's the medical model? It's probably, most likely, what all of you learned as a kid. Disability means something is wrong with someone. Maybe it's a genetic issue, maybe it's something happened to them, but disability is a problem that an individual has. On a social model, and this is the model that most activists are using when they're doing work in the world, when they're organizing, when they're talking to their political representatives, disability refers to the negative effects caused by how society responds to people's impairments. You might go, Joel, you snuck in a new term, impairment. That's bad. Define your terms. All right, here we go. So on the social model, an impairment refers to an abnormality, or you can even say atypicality, a difference in someone's body and mind. Disability refers to the responses to that difference, responses to impairment. What does this actually mean? On a medical model, what is happening here? What do you see in this image?
Yes.
Yeah, something is wrong with this individual. Now, we don't know, maybe they're paralyzed from the neck down. Maybe they have really severe fibromyalgia and it's a high tiredness lethargy day. We don't know exactly why they're using the wheelchair, but something is wrong with them and they can't go up the stairs. Sucks to be them. On a social model, exact same image. What do you see?
The axis must be just down the shoulder.
Yes. Yeah, I love it. You see that a group of people, and trust me, the way this most concrete, it was not one person, maybe 10 or more people made a conscious decision that to get from point A to point B over an incline, they would only make that traversal accessible to people who can ambulate up steps. And let me be very clear here, this is not just about disability. If you go to the grocery store and you have a lot of groceries with you because you went to Trader Joe's and you love Trader Joe's, that joke doesn't work in New Zealand. That's shit. Sorry, American joke. I love Trader Joe's. And you have lots of bags, whatever, this can be perilous. If you have kids and you've got strollers and whatever, this can be perilous. There's like tons of reasons why stairs are not the best way to do this sort of thing. But there was a choice by people to exclude those who can't traverse in this particular way. A social model framework gives you a wildly different interpretation of this exact same scene. And it's at this stage that I want to be very, very clear. The point that activists are making is not an either or, right? A joke in disability studies circles is like, if you go to the emergency room and they're using the social model, you're going to walk out and go to a different one. You want the medical model, the quote unquote medical model. You absolutely want that in certain circumstances and in certain ways. This is about both and. This is about having both of these kind of interpretive lenses to appreciate what is actually happening. It's not an either or. So we've gotten at least one step. We've made a little bit of progress in getting away from the ableist conflation, right? We can see that a social model lens provides us already with a more kind of expansive understanding of disability, and also with a way of seeing that disability understood as a lack or deprivation that causes pain or suffering at just an individual misses something fundamental about the interaction between an individual and their environment. But you might be thinking, okay, sure, that's true if you're using a wheelchair. But what if you're born with infantile Tay-Sachs, right? No, the most perfectly accessible world. We could have universal design done in the best way possible. How is that going to help someone where there's a fundamental underlying the hexamizidase A, I don't remember the biology. There's a particular protein not being made. The child, the infant is going to, best case scenario, live to 4. They're going to be in pain, very serious pain. That can only be addressed symptomatically. We don't have the current knowledge doesn't allow us to get at the drivers of infantile Tay-Sachs. So you've got inevitable death, significant pain and suffering. How does a social model doesn't seem to get at that, right? It seems like a medical model understanding is a better way of understanding something like infantile Sachs, and it seems to prove the ableist conflation to be true in certain cases. Is it not just true that being disabled in the sense of infantile Tay-Sachs is to live a life with pain and suffering? This problem in conceptualizing disability has been long recognized in disability studies. And a book that does not get read or studied nearly as much as I think it should is Susan Wendell's The Rejected Body. This came out in 1996. And in some ways, I think Wendell articulated this problem more clearly than almost anyone when she said, look, this is the problem of suffering that justice cannot eliminate. And you might notice that I'm going to focus on disability, but there are other ways of picking out our experience that this gets at, right? Perfectly just world, an ideal world, can't get rid of all suffering. And that's something we really should probably worry about and think about as we consider how to make things better. I call this, for shorthand, I call this the hard problem of disability. And I think that the underlying kind of explanation for why it's a hard problem is this heterogeneity issue, right? You've got infantile Tay-Sachs on the one hand, you've got people who, the way in which they're disabled, they take pride in and are very happy about on the other. It seems like we cannot, how can we explain disability in a way that captures this heterogeneity? There's a further, I won't go into detail on this, there's a further historical point that could be made here. It's not just that disability is heterogeneous right now in 2023. Disability communities come into and out of existence. Think about polio, right? We don't have a polio generation, and we probably, well, in the US, we may again because vaccinations, but that community was distinct historically. there's all sorts of disabilities that have this kind of modulation effect and come into and out of existence. And that's another aspect of the heterogeneity of disability. So how in the world do we solve, or at least try to deal with, the hard problem? And this is how I'm gonna, this will wrap up the end of the talk, is trying to solve this. This is now the second book. So I gave you the kind of précis of the life worth living. Now I'm getting into what will make up the meaning of disability, which I did say it's forthcoming in 2024, but that's just the promise I made to my editor. I'm not sure I'm going to make that deadline. We'll see. Sometime in the next year or two, the book will come out. Well, let's start. Let's enter this problem through another book that I want to make sure to give credit to, which is Elizabeth Barnes's fantastic 2016 book called The Minority Body. And in it, she makes the following claim. There is nothing about what disabled bodies are like that by itself unifies or explains the category of disability. This is, I think, a different way of phrasing what I just said, that disability experiences are widely heterogeneous, but because it's Barnes and she does metaphysics, she's putting it in a much more precise way. And you can see, of course, that the by itself is doing the load of the analytic work there in the claim. And here's how she cashes out. So she holds that to be true. There's nothing about disabled bodies that by itself explains it, but she still wants to give a theory of disability. And here's how she goes about doing that. And if you're not used to a certain style of analytic philosophy, I'm very sorry. This is why they don't let us near politics, because this is not bumper stickery at all. But nonetheless, a person S is physically disabled in a context C, if and only if. 1. S is in some bodily state X. You might say bodily, is that inclusive of mental? No, Barnes, for lots of different reasons, says it's too complicated to deal with psychological and mental stuff. I'm just talking about physical disability. As you might imagine, that has gotten a lot of pushback in the responses to her book, but I at least give her points for honesty and being like, I think it's too complicated. Nonetheless, S is in some bodily state X. 2, the rules for making judgments about solidarity that are employed by the disability rights movement classify X in context C as among the physical conditions that they are seeking to promote justice for. What Barnes is trying to do is, instead of indexing disability to some state of affairs in the world, some facts, whether natural or social, about bodies, she's trying to index disability to how a group of people, the disability rights movement, understand their political aims. It's a very ingenious move to get a definition of disability off the ground that admits it's wildly heterogeneous and doesn't want to fall into some kind of naturalist trap. Now, one more complaint: there is no the disability rights movement. That's just false. There are multiple types of disability rights movements, but to treat that as one thing is like absolutely incorrect. And Barnes, again, she's among other things, in addition to being brilliant, she's very humble. She has a footnote that says, yeah, I'm just going to pretend. This is heuristic that it's one thing. So she knows that this is a problem in the definition. Now, there's a lot to say about this. I think this was an amazing step forward in offering a concept of disability and theorizing about disability, but there's a bunch of problems. So people have tried to come up with ways of improving upon or pushing back against Barnes's view. One of these comes from my colleague Sean Oz and also Dana Howard, who's at, I think, Ohio State University. A different version of this was given by Jessica Bagong at she at Durham. I think she's at Durham. Anyway, you can Google her name. And they say that no, actually, it's not about, disability is not about being tied to what the disability rights movement is trying to promote justice for. It has to do with a certain type of exclusion or discrimination that's being experienced. You can hear a kind of more social model-y explanation. Alex Gregory, in a 2020 piece, I can't remember the journal this came out in. It doesn't matter. You can also Google that. He interestingly doubled down on an older version of disability. He said, no, this is just about species typicality. If something is in an almost statistically outside of the bell curve sense atypical, that's what it means to be disabled. I don't know anyone who likes, it's an interesting argument. No one seems to like it. I'm sorry to Alex, but nonetheless, it's out there. And then we get, as I mentioned before, deflationary views, right? Views that say you can't come up with some unifying explanation. You can't even come up with it by doubling down on disability rights movements or by doubling down on some sense of social discrimination. Thomas Nadelhofer just said there is no unity. He just thinks it's incoherent. The concept is actually incoherent because there's no way to unify it explanatorily. Jonas Boudry made an interesting argument that not enough people have taken up, where he's like, why are we arguing about this? Just stop it. Stop it, philosophers. We don't need a unifying explanation, because think about how we use the concept in the world. What disability means in a legal context is actually pretty damn clear, and that's fine. Let's do that there. What it means in a political context, also quite clear, thanks to activists, that's fine. What it mean, and he's just kind of like, let these different pockets of explanation do their thing and stop trying to have a grand unified theory. And I'm gonna fall prey to being like, but I want one. So, but you'll see if you'll like my answer at the end here. And then Kevin Tempe drew on Wittgenstein, and I can't remember. Ballung is this German concept is also used in philosophy of science. He's like, look, it's fuzzy. It's a family resemblance fuzzy concept. He's got a point. All these people have a point, but I'm still dissatisfied with it. And last but not least, this is another, I have lots of complaints of people not paying attention to the literature that came before them. Not enough people remember that Anita Silvers, one of the original OG philosophy of disability studies scholars, argued for a neutral model of disability all the way back in 2003. And this gets it's like deflationary, but it still has some kind of glue holding it together. I highly recommend you go read that piece as well. All right, coming to the end here. What's the issue? Well, a different way of phrasing the hard problem is that all existing theories of disability, they simply don't pick out a set of paradigmatic cases. The ones that can explain deafness and degenerative MS can't explain infantile Tay-Sachs. The ones that can explain all of that can't explain ADHD and autism, whatever. So they're just actually not expansive enough. And a second issue, and this I won't go into because it's way more in the weeds kind of for a very particular subset of philosophers. I don't think they explain a satisfactory set of paradigmatic uses of the concept. The way, so if you go ordinary language philosophy and kind of locutions and stuff, I don't even think they can explain how humans use the concept. Both of these are very serious issues. And of course, I will solve it. I'm going to solve the problem because that's what they pay me to do. No, we'll see what you think. I'm going to skip this for time. What I was going to do is try and really further motivate how intense this problem is. And I was going to contrast, for example, I already mentioned infantile Tay-Sachs as I went into a little bit of detail about that. And what I was going to try and do is kind of pump your intuitions about how wildly different sorts of disability are. Contrast infantile Tay-Sachs with something like deafness, where you have people, this is especially true of people who are born congenitally deaf, but by no means all, who will argue deafness is not about hearing loss. If you think deafness means you can't hear, you do not understand what it is to be deaf. What it is to be deaf is to be part of a linguistic community, a community that uses a particular language, ASL, BSL, whatever the variation might be, as part of their life. And in the same way, it'd be really weird to airdrop me in the middle of Moscow and I can't speak Russian and then be like, oh, you're disabled, poor thing. You have a fundamental deficit. Like, no, I just don't speak the language and I'm not part of this culture. People who are deaf, and usually this is contrasted with deaf capital D, will say deafness is about the game, the world that I get to be a part of through ASL. That's so different, so wildly different than talking about what it means to be disabled relative to Tay-Sachs, what it means to be disabled relative to Down syndrome. And so I was going to try and really motivate that, but for time, I think you get the point. I'm also going to skip this. This is my all right, we're doing theory building. What are all of our desiderata? We need to know all the things we want the theory to do. Can it do all these things? And I have a very, very over-the-top list here that we can talk about in the Q&A. But the point is, a good theory of disability needs to do a lot. And here's the answer. My proposal of a solution. When we use the concept of disability, we are using it to provide reasons. We are in the game of giving reasons, right? So you're going to hear some random here and also just a general kind of pragmatism theme. We're giving reasons to structure relations in ways that will provide or improve flourishing across ability states. What does that mean? The person who is deaf in a capital D sense, proud of their deafness, views it as a game. When they say, I am disabled and I'm proud, they're saying, respect the way in which I am different. They're saying, allow ASL to be taught in schools so that more people speak my language and can be a part of my community. They're making a claim, they're giving reasons to structure relations in such a way that deafness understood in that sense is allowed to be a part of our linguistic and cultural larger world. The person who is a near Olympic level athlete who got hit by a bus, who became paraplegic. Let's fast forward after those first 2 years. We know from the social science, they're going to be really depressed and almost definitely suicidal. It's a very difficult ability transition. The social science also says that after that 2 to 3 year period of adjusting to a very different way of being, most people report similar levels of quality of life. But that person who says, I wish I wasn't disabled, right? I wish this had not happened to me. I wish I was not paraplegic. What are they saying when they use the concept of disability? They're providing reasons to structure relations such that people don't get hit by buses and go from being ambulatory to paraplegic. They're providing reasons to give them the supports they need as someone with paraplegia. Maybe that's a nice electric wheelchair with a actually functioning battery that can be easily replaced. Maybe that's access to Paralympic sports. Maybe that's, I don't know, just basic access so that they can get around. So curb cuts, all of this sort of stuff. Again, they're providing reasons to structure relations in ways that will provide flourishing for the ability state in question. So you can have someone who's disabled and totally proud and happy of the way in which their disability shapes their life, and someone who's not. And yet we can explain that there's still a there is still a unification to the sense of disability in the way that it's providing reasons. In other words, here's the more bumper stickery, here's a nicer, less precise way to put it. What unifies disability, what unifies the concept, is the way it articulates goals towards which society should strive as a matter of justice. I'm building in the sense of pluralism for my matter of justice. I'm not going to say justice is fairness because then I have to talk about roles, and I just don't want to talk about roles. I'm sorry. And I think that is the kind of big takeaway. Whether or not you like my answer to the hard problem of disability, whether or not you like my proposal about offering a kind of unified theory of the concept, if we do care about making an anti-ableist world, it's gonna require engineering not simply things to be more accessible in our built environment and our social environment for that matter, it's also gonna require some conceptual engineering. I think we need to spend a bit more time focusing on how we think about disability and how we use that concept. And I honestly, genuinely believe that's also part of building out a more anti-ableist world. Oh, I forgot I had this. I love this quote. This is just as timely of a quote as when it was written as it is today by Fanon in Toward the African Revolution. And he says, look, the function of a social structure is to set up institutions to serve needs. That's like the best definition of what societal institutions are to do. I love this. And he says, a society that drives its members to desperate solutions is non-viable, a society to be replaced. Right now, most societies are non-viable for way too many disabled people. And I hope we set about replacing them. Thank you.
I wanted to invite my colleague, I think included help us with the Q&A.
Great, yes, thanks very much, Joel. I'll just, yeah. Okay, so people online, if you can raise your hand or give a thumbs up or something virtually if you have a question, and then we'll call on you and you can unmute. Any questions online? In the room. Everyone who has a question, put your hand up and I'll try and keep a note of it. Yes. And just raise your hand during the talk and I'll direct it to you.
More of a comment than a question. Thank you. Thank you very much for pulling it all together so nicely about that. One of the things with your definition and that I find interesting is I work in nursing and teaching nursing students. When we're working with people who are living with disability, often people who are highly resilient, if not in our first year nursing students, or people who show a lot of resilience with constantly changing health conditions, don't talk about disability at all, or limitations or anything else. The one time that we have to move into talking about limitations and disabilities when you're trying to access services. So that's the moment in the time when they have to say, actually, yes, I have incontinence problems. Before that, it's not an issue until it's a way of actually becomes the mechanism. So I think your definition has got possibilities. it fits to me with the experience that we actually have.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Thank you.
Joel, we have 3 things in the chat here. If you're able to click on them. Yeah.
Are we gonna do one audience, one Zoom, one? Are we gonna flip back and forth
We'll take them as they come.
as they come in?
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, hello.
Thank you. How do you pronounce? Is it Aotearoa?
Aotearoa.
Aotearoa. All right. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the UN UNCRPD, United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is a very important framework. How does that fit in with the theories you mentioned? Yeah. So the definition of disability from the UN, and I can say a similar thing about the definition of disability from the World Health Organization, right? The International Classification on Functioning, Disease, and Health, the ICFDH. These are definitions at the end of the day that are focused not simply on questions of health, healthcare, and how societies relate to caring for bodies and populations. They're also thinking about development. And there's I have a long there's a lot to say here about the relationship between disability and colonialism and the way in which I'm gonna go into a rant about the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank here if I don't stop myself. Disability understood in the contemporary structures of nation states is in many ways, I think, very limiting. That is my main point. I do think the UN definition is good insofar as it is motivating a concern for disabled people understood as a population to whom and for whom fundamental human rights are necessary. That's great. But I still think even the human rights framework has limitations and bumps up against the way in which our current nation state configuration is still fundamentally colonial and extractive in the relationships between these nation states. And so I just, there's good things about it, but there's some bad things about it as well. And I'll leave that there. Will the slides be made available? I can, if you email me, I'll send you the slides.
Okay. John. So thank you, fantastic talk. I'll learn a huge amount from that. And thank you also for your question. It kind of click on one of the things I was thinking about. So I was thinking about, say, the person who is living an excellent life and as part of the deaf community finds themselves, who would want to be locked into the center of Moscow right now. But anyway, I suppose they do. And all of a sudden things are more difficult. On your reasons giving account, that person, the concept of disability just might not be relevant. Yeah. So that's really helpful. But even in that sort of situation, you can sort of trace back to think about the reasons why for that person it's not relevant, like the things that you get.
Right.
It seems,
yeah. And I kind of skipped over this, but there is a subset of the deaf community in the capital D sense
I'm not sure this is happening as much today, but it was in the past, who were saying, I'm not disabled. And we're denying disability at all as a way of thinking of deafness. And of course, the way I explain what's going on there is that you have to be operating with a problematic definition of disability, one that already has something like the ableist conflation working, to think that that statement is doing what I think the people who are saying that, what they think they're saying. They're trying to say, I understand deafness is a gain, not a loss, therefore it's not a disability. It's like, how about you don't assume disability is a loss, and then you don't have to, you can still say you're disabled. And it does, though, that point, I want to make clear, that does point out how, on the reasons giving account, disability is like tons of things can qualify as disabilities. And a complaint, a critique, an objection, however you want to phrase it, that a lot of people raise to my explanation is that it actually is too expansive. It captures too much. And I usually say, I'm like, well, if you can give me really good reasons why it captures too much in like a purely conceptual sense, that's one thing. But politically, I honestly just think that that's the right move. And that, you know, I think about a lot of the activism around disability in the United States, at a minimum, since at least 2008, the kind of banner and clarion call has been disability justice, not disability rights, right? That was the fight to get the ADA up and running and all of this stuff. And people who are doing the on-the-ground activism around disability are so clear that disability is encompassing of everyone. So like Talila A. Lewis argues, she doesn't say that like everyone is disabled. She won't phrase it that way, but she'll say that everyone can be affected negatively by ableism, completely regardless of your identity relation to disability. Ableism can be a problem for everyone. And this, I think, is a really deep insight that we need to think about, and also one that allows us to see how disability concerns are far more expansive than we might realize at first blush.
Right, we've got Alison, and then we've got 2 questions online.
Sure, thanks. My question sort of follows on, you sort of touched on it, but I just thought to start with, so the Māori term that's being used for disability in Aotearoa is tangata waikaha, people with strength. So I thought,
really,
from an ableism point of view, you might be interested in that.
That's
phrase.
fascinating.
Yeah, term. But my question is really, so do you think disability is really just a legal construct? Because you touched on it, like the definition of disability under our Human Rights Act and the CRPD is sort of includes everybody in this room, basically, you know, everybody in one sense. And isn't it more about a conduit or some sort of entitlement to agency and rights that might for people that are disadvantaged?
Yeah. So I think, you know, go back to 1965, the year, right? Paul Hunt and Pius in the UK, and some of these really early fights for people with disabilities to be, in the UK, it was more, you know, you're working with a welfare state system. You want to be recognized relative to certain services and goods that are being provided to other populations. In the US, of course, we don't care about people. You know, there's no social services whatsoever, more or less. I'm only slightly exaggerating, as 1 in 5 of our citizens still don't have access to basic healthcare. Nonetheless, the fight there was more about, they wanted to go a constitutional route. They're like, that will never happen. So they went anti-discrimination route, following on the civil rights movement legislation. If you say to me in 1965, well, isn't the concept of disability, isn't what's really being mobilized here about legal protections? I'd be more tempted to say yes then. But today, I mean, disability is as much a identity marker as someone's gender is, or their sexuality, or their age, or their fill in the blank. I think today disability, the thickness of the term now is one of the more central ways in which people understand who they are in social space. And again, my point is that's definitely, I don't think true. It's unquestionably not true historically, but I do think now it's way more complicated. And the legal understanding is a piece, a absolutely central important component, but it's much broader than that now at the level of its role in kind of social life. That's not going to be true for all groups, of course, and that's absolutely not true. You know, if we're like doing a fine-grained global analysis, that's not gonna pan out. I am adding some implicit qualifications of what I'm saying that I'm hoping you're also hearing.
A couple of messages on the chat there, Joe. We have also experienced here the intersection of pollinators and euthanize. Yeah, so I mentioned Talila A. Lewis, who's a disability justice advocate, community organizer. I also think of them as a scholar. If you Google Talila A. Lewis ableism, you'll get a definition of ableism that I think is the best one that has ever, like, it is absolutely the best definition I have run into. And one of the things that Lewis makes absolutely clear is you simply cannot think about ableism and disability without its intersection with the history of colonization, without its intersection with anti-Black racism in particular in the United States and Britain, but also in other parts of the world, without patriarchy. And Lewis just kind of builds out this very nuanced, genuinely intersectional in the Combahee Collective Crenshaw sense of intersectional understanding of ableism. And that is the go-to point for me. Like, that's the touchstone. I didn't go that direction in this talk because then that would have been a very different talk. But I think that's a great place to turn to. So one last question from Janine, and then we'll bring things to
I'm Janine Winters, and I'm doing work right now on an end-book project on euthanasia. And I spent my morning looking at quotes from providers. And what struck me then and struck me now in listening to your talk was people who were sensitive to the social model disability and were saying that we should look at depression and not getting services when they live in remote areas. And people who are saying, I am releasing this poor person from their suffering.
Yeah.
And both of them, even the ones who were really, felt like they were releasing the person from their suffering, they make these narratives about how important autonomy is and how important what their work is, but they don't seem to see that there are social aspects to them person suffering. And I don't know quite how to fit that in my worldview about this and in your philosophy.
Yeah. The debates over, the debates over physician aid in dying and euthanasia are really taking on a different tenor right now, especially because of what's happening in Canada, right? Where we're watching the old slippery slope argument. We're just watching the slope be slippery. We're watching the policies slide in real time, and they keep getting wider and wider and wider and wider, in a way that everyone who was against this stuff was like, this is what will happen. So what I'm going to say now in 2023 is quite different than what I would say a number of years ago, but I'll just say this. Whether Canada, US, fill in the blank of your nation state, there are resource limitations. There are budgets for where we put our money for things under the banner of health. And it drives me up a wall that you would have a country like, Canada is better than the US on most things in healthcare. It gets more complicated, obviously, when we're talking about rural areas of Canada, but the fact that you would have all of this investment in individualized solutions to what we know are fundamentally interpersonal and organism environment interaction things, even in the case of treatment refractory depression, even in the case of treatment refractory fill in the blank, the social epidemiological research is so compelling that changing structures and the situation and setting, to use the anthropological term, of people can be transformative. And then people throw their hands up and put their funding behind, or put their political weight behind, or put their whatever behind more individualistic solutions. I find that enraging. At the same time that I find it enraging, I'm not, in the same way that I am staunchly, I want to live in a world where we are pluralistic about the good life. And that we can have multiple, even competing visions of what it's like to live a good life. I do think we want a world where we can have multiple competing visions of a good death. And some of the disability rights activism around the physician aid in dying and whatnot just shuts the conversation down completely. And that does worry me. I mean, just turn to cultural anthropology and you can see immediately how quote unquote Western attitudes towards dying are really particular and historically odd, among other things. And so I do hope we can find a way to have some of those harder conversations at the same time that our priorities and the way we're approaching questions of health are not individualistic.
Best answer I could imagine.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, so first, there's a number of thank yous here. So first, thank you, Josie, for arranging this terrific talk. Thank you all for coming. And there's a further talk tomorrow night, tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. in Calhoun, just over there in the hospital on the first floor. Easy to find, easy to access as well through the lifts. And we hope to see you all there, as well as I'm sure many other people from the community.
And there will only be about 5 minutes of overlap. I made sure that the two talks were distinct, just in case you show up, but the spirits of the talk are the same.
Excellent. And thanks to everyone online for coming as well. And, you know, so bioethics is one of those things where, you know, we think about, as most academics do, you know, what is it that we're really doing? And, you know, we're ultimately in various ways trying to make the world a better place. And I think this is a talk that is definitely, you know, showing how you can do that in one area. And so thanks very much, Joel, for doing that. Now, before we thank you, though, there's a last question there, which is, what's one thing that each of us could do in our lives to advance the voice of those with disabilities? Thank you for that question. So, Joel, perhaps you could just quickly answer that.
Yes. If I'm limited to one thing, I would say that make sure whatever you are doing politically is always centering and advancing what the disabled people in your community are caring about and wanting. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the disability community wants, but the fact, like, I do not know the context in New Zealand around this, but at least in the US, there are so many people where it's like they have multiple family members who are disabled and even identify as disabled, and they have like no idea about the policies of their local politicians or even the federal ones about disability. And there's a disconnect. And so making disability issues central to how you think about political life, regardless of whether or not you identify as disabled, that is, there's only one thing, do that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joel.
That message like 2 months ago. Just had
Yeah, we just had the election.
Yeah, too late. Okay, well, the next time. When is it happening?
3 years, it's not that long.
Oh, okay, all right.
3 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just enough time to rush through some hastily composed legislation and
Yes, of course.
yeah. We do all that. Yeah, so at the moment they're in coalition negotiations. Next member
How many names?
Well, so we've got about sort of 5 parties, I suppose. We've got sort of far right party, centre right party. They look, they're pretty much
Like so many places.
yeah. Then we've got a sort of a centre populist party. So unfortunately, kind of has quite an outsized input. Usually sort of, it can often determine the government. It's sort of centrist, but it's also populist. Coming through. And so the, you know, what this has displaced is might have just similar idea of sort of wonderful charismatic. So clearly government has But it's
Everyone who cares about people in the world knows who that is.
yeah, right, we're all supporting. She's so lovely. Yeah, she's like, yeah, so much. Yeah, that's right. But she, so we couldn't have, kind of had it back. And
Should have paid her more.
I asked the numbers. So yeah, that's right. And then, but she's, because our last very popular Prime Minister was John Key, Prime Minister, and he also, sort of stepped away, sort of in the end of, when they were still very popular as Labour. Jacinda was having quite a lot of abuse and things like that, I think, particularly around responsibility. And so she sort of run out of.
We all went hard on it.
Yeah.
You were like, I'm doing firm.
Yeah, totally.
You're actually doing it.
Well, it's right. That's right. And we had this, we had a lot of solidarity around it. There's a lot of saying, the team of 5 million, and there was a lot of that, sort of solidarity. What comes with that is, that sort of stuff, so there was a disaffected one. Parliament, it went on for ages. So there was all sorts of disruption that is not evident